Well, once again, I want to thank you to everyone for attending ASLE and ACE 2023. We hope you had a great time here in Portland, and thank you. And thank you for consider coming. I'm hoping that you consider coming back. Sorry, it's kind of like the end of the whole conference, and I'm tired, which is logical, and you know, we're humans. We want to thank also once more the people that made possible ASLE and ACE, and every bit of help was very vital in making this, what I think it was a successful conference, and we made it. We're done. I am so delighted to introduce our final keynote speaker today, Mexican writer Cristina Rivera Garza. Before she begins, I would like to say some words regarding her work and the person she is. I met Cristina in 2011 when I invited her to give a talk in a symposium I organized on the poetics of displacement. We have been in contact since then, but it was a little bit later when she was hired to create the first PhD program in creative writing in Spanish at the University of Houston that I had the privilege and the luck to work with her and to get to know her better. Not only did we begin to collaborate at an institutional level, but also to think about the ways to bring Latin American writers to Houston. However, and this is her merit entirely, her presence in Houston began to populate the city with writers. Thanks to her program, the city began to flourish in a way I hadn't seen before. Cristina is a friend, but is also a model and an inspiration to me and many others. Not only is she an accomplished writer, she has received so many awards that it will be impossible to list them all in the time we have. But she's a beautiful and accessible person. She's also generous with her time and work and with her words. She's an inspiration because her level of engagement with social causes such as gender violence and environmental and social injustice is remarkable. She has inspired and continues to inspire generations that see in her that it's possible to be a writer, an academic, and an activist. She inspires you to rebel, to subvert, to question, and to turn the world upside down. One of her latest books, Liliana's Invincible Summer, is a testimony to our capacities to transform and mobilize through words the ongoing injustices perpetuated by a patriarchal system that acts as if it owned our lives because impunity reigns and victims, female victims especially, as is the case with Cristina's own sister Liliana, are stripped of their voices, lives, and are deprived of the opportunity to fight back. Other works such as Autobiografía del Algodón, about which she will be talking today, brings together stories of cotton production, forced migration, border violence, and climate refugees. Author, translator, critic, Cristina's recent publications include Liliana's Invincible Summer, published with Hogarth on 2023, and most recently, Me llamo Cuerpo que no está, Poesía completa with Lumen, also 2023. The Taiga Syndrome, translated by Susan Jill Devine and Aviva Khanna with Dorothy Project, won the 2018 Shirley Jackson Award. Grieving, Dispatches from a Wounded Country, translated by Sarah Booker and published with the Feminist Press, was finalist of the 2020 NBCC Award. In addition, she received the 2021 International José Donoso Literary Award from Chile. She's a 2023-24 DAAD Artist in Residence in Berlin. She's an MD Anderson Distinguished Professor and founder of the PhD program in Creative Writing in Spanish at the University of Houston in the Department of Hispanic Studies. She's also a MacArthur Fellow for the years 2020 to 2025, and a member of Mexico's Colegio Nacional since 2023. Please welcome Cristina Rivera Garza.
Hola, buenas tardes. ¿Cómo están? Good, good, good. I understand that you've been working very hard and you're ready to play hard too. So that's the best part of the night. Thank you so much, Gisela, for that introduction. And thanks everyone for being here. Thank you for having me here. I attended just a couple of the panels in this conference, and they were really good, very thought-provoking, and with a very healthy combination of academic work and creative work. It was truly inspiring. Thank you so much for doing that. I'm going to be mostly talking about ideas contained in a book I published in Mexico and Spain a while ago, a couple of years ago. It has not yet been translated into English. Perhaps we'll see this book in English soon. Let's hope so. But I prepared this talk in English, so here we go. In early 1937, a wandering committee of landless peasants met with engineer Eduardo Chavez in the C1K1 encampment on the Mexican side of the Rio Bravo. They had just caught word that Chavez was somehow connected to agrarian reform efforts by the leftist government of General Lázaro Cárdenas, and approached him with a request for land. We don't want ejido land, that means state-owned land. They said quite bluntly. We want plots of private holding, however small. Chavez burst into laughter. You want to be hacendados, he said. He sneered, but was curious enough to ask for further details. As it turned out, the peasants came from El Sistema, a failed agrarian project based on irrigation system number 4 by Dam Don Martin in the triangle formed by 3 towns, Estación Camarón, Rodriguez, and Anáhuac, which is the name that appears in this map right there. You can see that. In the north of Nuevo León, some 15 or more kilometers from the US-Mexico border. As many, they had arrived there in the late 1920s, hoping to partake of the distribution of lands laid by the early revolutionary government, but as they failed to secure a peace for themselves, and rifts grew between older owners, local authorities, and bank representatives, they joined the fated strike of 1934 and fought side by side with about 5,000 agricultural laborers. And they lost. Political repression, soil erosion, and growing cracks on the wall of the recently built dam all played a role in the dramatic failure of the system. When families left in long, slow-moving caravans through the Mexican Northeast, the only thing they carried with them was their working experience growing cotton, and that's what they offered Chavez in exchange for private land. Soon, on December 10th, 1937, 100 families began clearing the lands on which Chavez's cotton experiment would take place, a place they named Anáhuac, making the Texas-Tamaulipas border for better or for worse, in any case for good, changing this place for better or worse, in any case for good. Jose Maria Rivera Doñez and Petra Peña, my paternal grandparents, were among those early settler families. I might as well begin this story of the vibrant relationship between migrant agricultural workers and the borderlands, and of both of them with cotton right here in late 1937. But in order to fully grasp the way in which cotton congregated landless peasants and state bureaucrats alike, foreign investors and utopian engineers in the Cardenista era, I would have to take you even back in time, deep time, lifting layer after layer of accumulated experience, both on the surface of the earth and in the atmosphere, writing as a geologist, sort of. James Scott famously argued that wheat makes states, and Sven Weckert that cotton makes empires. But this story brings to bear a little-known aspect of cotton as it was played out on Mexican borderlands. Cotton was a crop, indeed, a component of a complex geoecological history of the region, but it was more. A force in and of itself, a magnetic field of sorts, a language, both physical and cultural, that made the territory anew. Cotton laid the ground for the construction of the hard infrastructure that made the waters of the Rio Bravo available for Mexican agriculture for the first time since the signing of the Guadalupe Treaty in 1848. Cotton, in alliance with the agrarian reform efforts of early revolutionary governments, turned landless laborers and migrants into ejidatarios and small property owners. Unlike in the United States, where cotton was responsible for the existence of plantations and slavery, cotton on the US-Mexico border contributed to an autonomous way of life for thousands and thousands of families fleeing drought and racism and violence altogether. But over time, of course, cotton did more. After a couple of decades of notorious economic growth and much social mobility, the cotton experiment, one of the most successful programs supported by leftist President Lázaro Cárdenas throughout the 1930s, also laid bare the high cost of monoculture and export agriculture, soil degradation, raging plagues, overuse of fertilizers, which together led to the terricide and violence. The most contemporary stage of this ongoing terricide is, without doubt, the so-called war on drugs. How do we tell these multi-layered and highly contradictory stories, where human and non-human forces effectively intermingle, complicating the political and material histories of entire regions? How to take into account, and on an equal footing, the human experience in the making of territories such as the US-Mexico border without erasing the vibrant involvement of crops themselves. More to the point, in what ways are we required to alter or subvert received notions of writing, academic or otherwise, in order to honor the experiences of families and their affective relationship to land? How to embody in writing the ethical and aesthetic challenges brought about by events that unfold in the long arc that takes us from the origins of the US-Mexico border to the rampant violence of today. Questions such as these propel me into long years of research in archives and fields and the writing of Autobiography of Cotton, a creative cross-genre fiction, non-fiction piece, which is, at its very core, this story of migrant families and what they created in collusion and complicity with a border crop. Layer 1. early climate refugees, and northward migration. It might have been an early morning of the summer of 1901, or perhaps an evening of fall of 1904, after yet another failed harvest. It could have even happened a bit later, when persistent drought had already devastated the high plateau of central Mexico, and they had lost all hope. The only thing I know for certain is that Jose Maria Doñez and Maria Asunción Vázquez, both described as indigenous in their respective birth certificates, set out to journey on foot all the way from San Luis Potosí in central Mexico to the coal mining regions of northern Coahuila, very close to the US-Mexico border during the early 20th century, years before of the outbreak of the 1910 Mexican Revolution. They showed up in mining camps in northern Coahuila by 1905. He, now listed as an operario, a laborer, instead of as a labrador, which had been his standing when he worked for large haciendas as a farmhand. If genealogical information is correct, they had married in 1898, soon bearing a child whom they named Florentino, perhaps after the Huachichil rebel from the 18th century, legendary for this participation in the 1767 tumulto against the Spanish crown. Perhaps it was just pure coincidence. In any case, in 1899, a death certificate confirms that Florentino died shortly after birth from dysentery, a curable disease even back then. So maybe it was both grief and drought combined that turned them into early climate refugees, wage workers offering their labor in the dreadful coal mining towns where so many had lost and continue losing their lives even today. Jose Maria must have heard of the agrarian reform promoted by the early revolutionary governments in the mid-1920s, maybe a bit later. Maria Asunción had already died of pneumonia in Rosita, a mining town, after losing a second child and giving birth to two more. He might have participated in the armed phase of the 1910 Mexican Revolution, which spread all throughout northern Mexico, marrying not only once, but twice during the process. Again, the only thing I know for certain is that he arrived with Petra Peña, his third wife, my father's mother, in Estación Camarón, Nuevo León, where a state-sponsored agrarian experiment relying on a newly built dam and a newly developed irrigation system attempted to expand what ASLE Weizmann has called the desert threshold. That's Estación Camarón. That's an old picture of the town, the main plaza. Jose Maria and Petra worked for years on the cotton fields surrounding Estación Camarón, but failed to secure a piece of land of their own, prompting them to participate in the raging and fatidic 1934 strike that disrupted the entire region. Had they not cut word of lands made recently available by the government in the neighboring state of Tamaulipas, perhaps they could have returned to mining. But they did hear of the expanding reach of the agrarian reform, and off they went to Matamoros on the Mexican side of the Rio Bravo, where at last they were able to find a piece of land they could finally call their own. This story is long, and I truly hope I have not made it unnecessarily convoluted, But this is only the starting point of Autobiography of Cotton, the book I published in 2020, in which I sought to explore the migrant experience of both my paternal grandparents, de José María and María Asunción, and later José María and Petra Peña of this tale that I'm telling you, and my maternal grandparents who arrived in the same area more or less at the same time, but as deportees from the United States. That's another story, and I'm not going to be talking about that today. It's just too much. They deserve a whole paper. The story of my maternal grandparents, I think, is a whole chapter of the book and deserve a whole paper right here. As the archival and field research process began, I soon realized that telling the human side of this story would not suffice, for Cotton figured prominently and decisively in my grandparents' destiny and the destiny of the region they learned to call home, the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. Layer 2, inhabited footprints. As Mexican writer and activist José Revueltas once famously argued, the surface of the earth is never a tabula rasa. In his short essay, The Writer and the Land, he made clear that material location, which he equated to belonging, constitutes the most important and politically charged question humans and non-humans alike have to address inescapably. One never ventures into virgin territories. One enters into material contexts already shaped by presence and, more often than not, inconspicuous absence. The forces that play behind the former and the latter constitute the structural conflict on which we set our feet. One is always stepping into the silhouettes of footprints left by humans or animals, or even plants or rocks, on territories that are consequently radically shared. One is always stepping into inhabited tracks. José Revueltas published this is actually very slow. Let me see. Am I going too fast? Here's where we should be. José Revueltas published Human Mourning, his second novel, in 1943, some 9 years after he participated in the 1934 strike that congregated, according to some estimates, between 5,000 and 15,000 farm workers in Estación Camarón. I had read the novel in my youth, failing to realize that this story of striking workers and cotton fields closely related to a family history I had overheard at after-dinner conversations or drunken parties quite often without truly appreciating its relevance, both in the making of U.S.-Mexico border and for my life. I did not know, I have to admit, that José Revueltas had been on location in Estación Camarón, belonging, however briefly, to a territory central to my family history. Human Mourning, which Revueltas originally titled Inhabited Footprints, allowed me to lift a second layer of experience in the meaningful and tumultuous relationship established between cotton and land on the most eastern section of the U.S.-Mexico border. In many ways, José Revueltas' novel served as a guiding light into a land and time that generated little, if any, records. The opening scene of Human Mourning features young Chonita in her deathbed, surrounded by Cecilia, her weeping mother, and her father, who promptly darts off in search of a priest. Death is close by, menacing and luminous at the same time, sitting on a nearby chair, waiting for the right moment to leap into the girl's body. Soon others arrive, the last inhabitants of a once booming town that now dies out, half flooded due to a malfunctioning dam. Written in a style that has been rightfully described as baroque, maximal, excessive, in sentences that often run for pages on, Revueltas vividly depicts the emergence of the irrigation system, devoting countless fearsome scenes to the construction of the dam. Here you have it. The nuances of cotton production and the search of rifts between farm workers and the state bureaucracy, settlers and banks, that could eventually lead to the full-blown conflict, namely the strike. The novel, which has been historically read as a work of fiction based on central Mexico, received lukewarm, if not altogether unsympathetic, reviews upon publication. However, archival research I discuss in Autobiography of Cotton has shed light on the non-fiction basis of this work for the first time. Revueltas was a 19-year-old communist organizer when he arrived in Estación Camarón on the back of a horse. His instructions: organize the masses. He quickly set out to inspect, however, the surrounding situation, taking profuse notes on the history of the region, the nature of cotton production, the characteristics of soil, and the profile of the working and migrant population. Criticism wielded against human mourning mostly targeted the various discourses it contained, especially the long paragraphs devoted to the material conditions of production, which many found unliterary. Revueltas pontificated, some critics claimed, ascribing such strategy to his ideological underpinnings solely. However, when read in its proper context in northern Mexico, and as a work involving both field research and imagination, Human Mourning becomes a precursor of genre-defying pieces that work towards the archive. At least that's my argument. Revueltas' presence in Estación Camarón not only allowed him to garner the personal experience that would later become the main plot of Human Mourning. Contemporary critics may describe his note-taking, keen observations, and participation in the strike as a form of field research, one on which the novel was based. Because of his radical materialism, Revueltas did not understand human emotions as merely internal or psychological. Instead, he directly linked human affect to the range of locations on which they emerged and evolved. Unlike state bureaucrats that identified migrant workers as poor laborers only, Revueltas clearly perceived the indigenous background of many of the landless peasants that ended up working on the system. He not only made their ethnicity out, identifying most of his characters as indigenous peoples, but also coined the concepts of dance, time, and the wheel of stones to reflect on the true nature of the resilience of indigenous communities in Mexico. This is why I have argued elsewhere, with no evidence whatsoever, I have to admit, that Revueltas in fact met my grandparents, who walked, as many of his destitute characters, endlessly to the north in search of a better life. I think they did. I think they met. But well, it's just a matter of evidence, you know. That's when fiction comes into play. That critical fabulation, we should say. Yeah. More importantly, Revueltas brought into writing a political event that left few traces anywhere else. Had it not been for his visit to the north and his incisive interest on a workers' mobilization he perceived as world-altering, little could have been known about the men and women who participated in the strike, and less about the day-to-day operation of the system, including the most philosophical dimensions of it. Revueltas resorted to the land as an archive. And in writing Human Mourning, he also worked toward the archive, producing a layer of documentation on which he recorded the human and non-human experiences so often left out of state repositories. What motivated him was, indeed, the radical transformation of the world and the question about location and belonging, what we might term now territory and affect, remain paramount in this vision. Let's move on. Third layer, a city engineer and a general. I think I'm somehow here we are. Eduardo Chavez, a Mexico City engineer, might be the only ex-secretary of Water Resources ever to be laid to rest on Vallehermoso, Tamaulipas, a little-known border town the Cardenista regime built to welcome deportees back into Mexico after the 1929 crash during the Hoover era. Chavez's services were first required in the region in 1935 when chronic flooding from the Rio Bravo gravely endangered the city of Matamoros and surrounding towns. The federal government assigned him a modest budget, instructing him to see what he could do, hoping he'd use it in minor remedial projects. But he did more. Previous experience in the International Water Commission had alerted him of the deeply intricate nature of binational water distribution and its unequal relationship to agriculture on both sides of the river. So, instead of short-lived solutions, he launched an ambitious program centered around the production of cotton, as he named an agricultural and social experiment. First, however, he had to persuade General Lázaro Cárdenas of the legal and material feasibility of using waters of the Rio Bravo for agricultural purposes on the Mexican side of the border, something that no binational negotiation or engineering infrastructure had been able to secure before. During his time in Matamoros, Chavez learned of an existing irrigation system that used gravity and the natural incline of the terrain to direct the river floods to Mexican lands. Years of back and forth communications between Chavez and the federal government finally came to fruition when Cárdenas himself showed up in the area. Because he was also keen in supporting border towns both as a strategic defense operations against a neighbor from the north and as a refuge for incoming deportees, Cárdenas paid close attention to Chavez's vision. The legendary meeting took place on the presidential train amidst until lands and heavy clouds of mosquitoes. There, against the recommendation of a committee of city engineers that traveled with him, the president decided to fully support Chavez's vision. So this is, from old Anáhuac in Nuevo León to new Anáhuac in Tamaulipas. You could see there 60 hours if you walked all that in the whole region, 3,038 kilometers. The climate refugees who fled Estación Camarón after the 1934 strike had been looking for available lands when they faithfully met with Chavez at his encampment near Matamoros. Negotiations were long, and arguments went from work experience in cotton picking to personal determination. But at the end, Chavez agreed. Instead of receiving 15 square kilometers of state-owned ejido land, they will become the rightful owners of 20 square kilometers of small private property. In exchange, they would clear the land heavy with ebano trees and bushes and prepare the terrain for the first harvest of cotton in the area. Well documented in the Tamaulipas archive, this cotton experiment not only radically transformed the lives of 100 families that arrived initially, followed by many, many more, building waterways and straw huts, opening up roads and taking loans from the Mexican government, but also transforming land itself. These are known as the cotton municipalities in Tamaulipas. You might have heard some of these names of on the news lately: Mier, Camargo, Reynosa, Matamoros, as places of great violence, battlegrounds in the ongoing and misnamed war on drugs. Cárdenas did not have to wait long to receive samples of massively large cotton stems and buds in his Mexico City offices. Chavez's cotton experiment soon became the most successful agrarian agricultural project ever undertook by the federal government on the borderlands. Economic wealth and increasing export rates did not prevent, however, the noxious effects of monoculture and export agriculture on the well-irrigated lands. Although Chavez had prescribed a rotation cultivation system to prevent erosion, plagues which had become resistant to fertilizers as time went by, and drought brought this experience to an end by the 1960s. Cotton was quickly substituted by sorghum, which required more land to produce higher yields, leading back to land concentration, where the agrarian reform efforts had been trying to dismantle for years. Many original settlers left for cities in central Mexico, and more commonly to border towns in the United States, where they became cheap labor. When sorghum died out, assembly plants invaded the region, providing low-paid jobs for women, mostly. It was not too long afterwards the news of the increasing and spectacular violence spread throughout the north and eventually in other regions of Mexico. Third layer, terricide. It's not a happy story, I'm sorry. I arrived in Estación Camarón in summer 2017, right on time to witness how a bulldozer brutally pulled to pieces what little had been left of its main plaza. When asked, the machine operator said that they were preparing the terrain for fracking. Estación Camarón had been a ghost town for decades by then. Violence connected to the misnamed war on drugs had expulsed people from northern Nuevo León and Tamaulipas alike, forcing them to leave their agricultural past behind. Even though I researched in state and local archives, even though I interviewed settlers from the past and dwellers from the present, no one in Anáhuac, Tamaulipas, remembered the 1934 strike. Chavez's cotton experiment has not been completely erased from personal and collective memory, but it has become but a vague allusion to those times. Terricide is the name given to the material and spiritual destruction of entire ecosystems, human and non-human lives included. Terricide is a name for what Jalal Tufik described as a surpassing disaster, a disaster that affects both the material and immaterial aspects of social and cultural life and that requires a mode of writing able to activate forces still embedded in ruins. Write what you know is an old adagio I don't trust. When writing autobiography of Cotton, I certainly resorted to the knowledge I had been able to strain from the sifter of time, which was meager. Mostly, however, I undertook archival and field research to make out the presence of both family and community on the border of Cotton. Archives are by definition incomplete beings. Otherwise, they would constitute, as Borges once dreamed, the world. The world in and of itself. And so I worked with an intermingled fiction and nonfiction. In terms of content, I resorted to what Saidia Hartman has aptly called critical fabulation to bridge gaps in information, bringing factual and theoretical imagination to the forefront when documents faltered or just did not suffice. More importantly, I forged a cross-genre structure supple enough to embrace nonfiction from what in Latin America gets to be called crónica, to personal essays, to heterogeneous academic writing and theoretical meditations, as well as fiction, characters, dialogue, plot. In both, I worked strategically with point of view, making sure that Cotton's place remained as relevant in writing as he had been in the early 20th century on the Texas-Tamaulipas border. Saddling between fiction and nonfiction allowed me to maintain a critical distance from received notions of literary genre, academic writing included, using strategies usually ascribed to one genre to contest or subvert the conventional understanding of the other. My definition of escrituras colindantes, for colindar is a verb used to describe limits commonly shared and under dispute in terms of land and construction. Adjoining writing, the literal translation fails to convey the dynamism and conflict that easily surfaces in the Spanish colindar. In any case, this cross-genre structure constituted a fertile ground for questions of accumulation and justice, which become evident only over long stretches of time. The past, Serbian writer Milorad Pavic once argued, is always about to happen. The past, reminds us, Christina Sharp, is never the past. I've discussed geological writing as a material and materialist writerly strategy able to probe the layers of experience that constitute our different locations, and desedimentation, a term I borrowed from Catherine Jussoff, as a critical creative writing tactic able to dismantle and thus contest what appears to be natural or eternal before our eyes. In the final pages of Human Mourning, Revueltas had his main characters in an outward journey he called the Exodus. The once blooming town was nothing but ruins by then. And yet, Natividad, the leader of the once powerful strike, still believed that another land was possible, another agriculture, another way of belonging. The social environmentalism that Revueltas espoused through the character of Natividad was defeated, indeed, and the terricide that he questions in El Luto Humano now shows the most violent phase in the strategic collusion between the state and the entrepreneurs of gore capitalism known as drug lords. As the possibility of extinction and the time of soullessness ceased to be a mere concern of the future to become a real threat in our present, it would be fitting to honor, revise, and activate the potency of forces still embedded in our memory of cotton. And I'm leaving you with a picture of the land that my family, my paternal grandparents, originally received in Matamoros. That character over there to your left, right? That's our dog, little Lara, was very happy to found herself on this stretch of land with high emotional, affective content still for the whole family. Thank you so much for your attention.
Like we did before, if you have questions, we have 2 microphones. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation and for Autobiografía de Algodón. It's helped me connect with my mom's history picking cotton in Sonora. And my question is about the route that the book took and how it started, whether it was with El Luto Humano or with the desire to connect with your family's archive or Estación Camarón, and how it started.
I can talk about that for hours, but I'll try to keep it short. There were so many things involved. A book begins so many ways. There is always a first time, and then again and again. But, I have been living in this country for many, many years, and I always got the number of years wrong. Like, I have been living here for 14, and I would say to my friends, I've been here for 5 years. And they would look at me like, no, you're wrong, of course. And then I continue making that mistake until I had to admit that I have, I've lived here for more than half of my life. And so I had to come clean with my relationship to the border. I guess that's one very personal and emotional need I had. I was not yet living in Houston, but was thinking already about moving from San Diego, where I used to teach and live, to Houston. And Houston is a place very charged with affect, family affect. I still have family living there, and my parents had important connections to the place, my grandparents. So everything felt like the world was telling me, this is your next project, this is what you have to do. At the same time, those were the years that we were bombarded with news about migrant caravans of migrants coming all the way from Central America to the U.S.-Mexico border, and we became bitterly aware of the situation, especially, of migrants in general, but especially of children and families being separated right there, very close to areas where my family had lived or lives in some cases. So there were issues that had to do with my personal experience. There were issues dealing with urgent issues in the political arena about what the border is and what it means, how it was forged, how we made the border in general. And then I had access to some of the archive materials that would become essential for the research over time. And then I had a grant, and I had time to think about all these issues. So everything kind of combined and made these, which was, as I said, a highly personal, but at the same time, I like to think, very much connected to both present-day issues and issues from the past. I wanted to come clean, as I said, but at the same time, I wanted us to think about what it means to be on the border, what it means to be a border crosser, how these different sections of the border are highly specific, highly contested and highly specific histories, and I wanted this story to be prominent in the area. I don't know if you're aware of this, but Tamaulipas is a state in Mexico that gets very little attention. I mean, it's this state that is just an agricultural state, and it's close to the United States, and that's it. And you never heard anything good in any case about Tamaulipas, and now you hear lots of things, many of them negative about Tamaulipas. So there is this risk of stereotyping too, and creating black and white portraits of a place that is very complex. So I wanted to probe that complexity, and as I mentioned here in this paper, I used what I had in hand. I had the little memory that I had about these issues. I interviewed family members and all dwellers of this town of Anáhuac, Tamaulipas, and I spent a great deal of time with documents from the archive, something that, by the way, I really enjoyed doing, and it was very illuminating in the whole process. But that's more or less the scenario at the beginning.
Gracias.
Ándale, gracias.
Thank you so much. This was like profound and poetic and political and everything together. I'm not sure how can you do this. So I need just to say I was so glad to find you mentioning Jalal Tawfiq work about the withdrawal of tradition past the surpassing disaster. My dissertation is between El Mundo Árabe, America Latina, so it's very important to make this kind of connection, South-South dialogues. And my question mainly is about what you described as geological writing, like how writing can be dusty, muddy, bloody, like violent, the words themselves. And I'm really curious, as we say in Arabic, about take me to your kitchen and tell me how did you cook this? The process behind this, like between the personal and the archival.
Yeah.
And how do you move back and forth, and how do you also limit your emotional engagement? Yeah.
It's not an easy question to answer, as you well know. That's the reason you are posing that question right here, of course. Yeah, and you know, I'm a writer, of course, I'm a novelist, but I'm also a historian by training. So I'm very proud of it too. So as I used to say in Mexico, I paid my dues. I wrote my dissertation, you know, and so I have lots of respect especially for archival research. I think that's what being a historian, that's a gift that being a historian gave me, right? And the actual working of all these things that appear to be somewhat seamless, it's very convoluted and it's hard to explain, but I try. I will try with some images. When I work with fiction, and this is how I know I'm working in a fiction project. I'm usually just, I use a desk more or less of this size, and I have my computer, and I have some books stacks around me, and that's it. So I know this is fiction, right? But when I'm working a project like Autobiografía del Algodón, the whole space is covered by books, documents, notes, picture, archival things, artifacts, everything. So even especially physically, the setting of the writing gets totally transformed. In this project, I was very keen about making sure that whatever I mentioned, every single date, name, place, event, that would be something that any reader could check out. I could go to the archive and they could make sure that I did my homework, that it is there. This is not a poetic license, as some people might claim. I hate that, by the way. I mean, that's another conversation. So it becomes a matter of handling material documents. And then what these documents and archives do in general, at least for me, is that they slow the process of writing. They interrupt plot lines. There is no way of writing a straight story if archives are involved, especially if, as in my case, I want to make sure that the conditions of production of knowledge are honored too in the writing process. So that's also very important. And so meandering, going around, questioning official plot lines becomes a strategy whenever I'm working on this mode specifically, right? And then I'm convinced that if you write, I mean, if I'm going to start to write about something, it's because it's personally important, personally relevant. I'm always writing personal works. That doesn't mean that I'm talking about myself, right? But I'm completely invested in the process. I very much believe, and I've quoted Judith Butler a lot on this one, and on other things too, but this one I really like, about that little book, Giving an Account of Oneself. Do you remember that one? When she said, giving an account of oneself always involves giving an account of the you, not only of the I, but of the you. And I could add now of the we, of the community that we conformed as such in the plural, yeah? And so trying to connect these little rich, luminous pieces of information that are highly effective and highly relevant for my personal story, for my and my family's personal history, I think finding a way of connecting that with the larger issues, with issues that are also transpiring in the stories themselves, but that it is my task to link that picking out, right, with whatever I will be able to find in these obscure, at times difficult to read documents. And then, of course, yet the matter of structuring the work. I mean, much of the writing, as I mention often in my creative writing classes, we become the writer that we want to become, dealing with specifically with point of view and with the structure of our works. And of course, this is a matter of trying and failing again and failing better the next time. When I embarked in the autobiography of Cotton, I didn't know that this was going to look like that at the end. I tried to be very alert at what the writing process in and of itself is telling me. I really, really try to honor my documents and the stories they contain. And I'm very willing to follow whatever new lead I'm offered in that sense. So it's a very unstable work, and at times joyful, not always. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for this very moving work. I have been reading Autobiography of Cotton, and I always find something new when I read or talk about it. I wanted to ask about one aspect of the novel that I found paradoxically beautiful, which is your interest in tracing the land process of the agrarian reform with migrants and nomad communities. So I wanted to ask you about the relationships of those communities and those peoples with the land, and how, or if it was important for you to trace the relationships, because there is, I feel like the power of the space in the novel, and I found very beautiful how to trace something that is no longer there, and how to trace a relationship that is so mobile and always changing, and all the ways in which you talk about space, all the maps that appeared, and all these memories of these relationships or migrants that are like that I don't know if they changed or are gone or transformed, and so I wanted to ask you about those aspects, the relationship with the land, and to trace like these nomadic communities.
That's so interesting. And by the way, thank you for your reading of this work. I was at your presentation yesterday, and I was humbled by that. It's wonderful to have readers. It's just wonderful to have great readers. It's just a dream come true. So thank you so much. You know, I grew up in a family that proud itself of being nomadas. No? My parents would utter these words with great pride, and I learned to do that. And then, as I was conducting the research, I had to realize that there were different ways of interpreting that continuous wandering throughout the Mexican territory. And the story that I told you about my grandparents is precisely one of those. They didn't choose necessarily to leave their indigenous communities in central Mexico and becoming operadores in these very dangerous works in the coal mines. They were expelled. They were pushed out. And my maternal grandparents, they were expelled from the southward from the United States into Mexico. So that made me think about the value of the word, what it meant, what kind of wrong this word and this plot line was trying to write, because this is a word that they use with great pride. So as though we made a decision, so we had choices. And you read these documents and you are like, I don't know. Doesn't look like that to me from this perspective. And then I was reading a lot about plants and about, I always thought that the movement in general was a good thing, right? So my grandparents migrated, my parents did too, I did too, so there must be something inherently good about it. Then I was reading about plants, and all of you know these more than I do, but about the resourcefulness of plants, being in one place and yet developing all these different skills. And for the first time, I was forced to think, perhaps settling and developing roots is not necessarily what I've been taught to think about, right? There is this occasion in which my son, who was born in San Diego, I was inviting him to come with me to Houston, and he replied by saying, you know, unlike you, I know how to develop roots, right? And so that made me think, like, I need to revise this whole story, and I think this work taught me to do that. I had to pay closer attention to the stories my father told me about his relationship to those 20 square kilometers of land and the way in which the whole family took care of that. There are plenty of photographs, plenty of stories about that relationship. Not plenty, I mean, I'm talking about 10 or 15, which is a lot, you know, given the fact that there is almost nothing in public record. So there is always there are always these comments, but very timidly made, as though you are afraid the whole situation is going to come undone immediately. Like you are connected, but you are not allowed to show that much, because that connection might be just it must not be, you know, long-lived. And so there is that tentative, affective connection to land, which is strong, but is cautious at the same time. And I think trying to capture that in words and in this story was part of the challenge, mostly. So I entered the story thinking highly, and I still do think, of course, of the challenges and the many lessons that come with wandering around, with crossing borders. But at the same time, I think I become more careful about noticing the parts of the story where people are cautious, but they are really invested emotionally there. It's a love, but it's a love that knows that sometimes stories end badly, and that you have to administer your feeling accordingly, right? So that's part of the human side of this migrating cycle that has taken my family again and again from Mexico into the United States and back. It seems that is recurring. Let's see how it ends. Yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah, go ahead.
I think we need to, because the reception starts at 6, but you can come and ask Cristina directly here. We want to thank Cristina so much for her wonderful talk. And before we all get dispersed, I wanted to announce that ASLE has unexpectedly lost one of its most valued UK members, John Parham, and we would like to invite Greg Gard to come up and say a brief tribute. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Hi, I'm Greg Garrard. I'm right now a professor at UBC in Canada. But I was chair of the UK and Ireland branch of ASLE from 2004 to 2010. And I was also involved with the journal Green Letters from 2008 to 2015. And so I just wanted to say a few words, very few words about my friend and colleague, Professor John Parham, who died recently. He was a professor of environmental humanities at the University of Worcester. He was a prolific and very wide-ranging author and editor. Some of his recent books include Green Media and Popular Culture, an Introduction, which is excellent, and the fantastic edited collection, The Cambridge Companion to Literature and the Anthropocene. I recommend that one very highly. Probably have some authors from it in this audience now, which is a terrific book. In parallel with Scott Slovic here in the US, John shepherded the Green Letters from an academic newsletter into a journal that was acquired by Routledge and is now really one of the 2 or 3 kind of top academic journals in our field. He was an editor for that for well over a decade. And I think that, his death has caused me to kind of reflect on the way in which we perhaps don't fully acknowledge the role of editing as a form of building community. It's anyone that's done editing knows, and perhaps especially journal editing, it's really hard work, and yet it kind of takes place in the background to a degree and doesn't get lauded in the way that writing a monograph or something like that does. I really miss John's mordant humor. He was very funny in a kind of reserved kind of way, and his incisive but unassuming intelligence. He was not somebody who felt that he perhaps could waste time on self-promotion, which is, I sort of took it up with him last year because I said, people really need to have access to your stuff some more. You need to kind of put it out there somewhere. But also he had this really powerful sense of literature and culture as political, and I know that seems obvious in this room, but for him that was really urgent. It was immediate, it was meaningful, and he took that, I think, especially from the work of Raymond Williams, the great Welsh Marxist literary critic. He was a kind of acolyte and exponent of cultural materialism in that tradition. His best book is actually quite hard to get hold of. It's called Green Man Hopkins. And if you're doing work on eco-poetics, I would recommend it very highly as indispensable and really, really original. That came out in 2010. And he writes about Gerard Manley Hopkins's idea of in-stress, which is this sort of indwelling force or energy that for Hopkins animates nature, for sure, but also, perhaps more surprisingly, society and literature. So it is this kind of unifying conception. And so I just wanted to finish on by just reading a Gerard Manley Hopkins poem. John was most emphatically an atheist, And yet, I think that for him there was no contradiction in his kind of greatest love in literature, being a Jesuit. This poem talks very much about God, but I think for John that represents, can be taken to represent a kind of a much more inclusive and non-sectarian sense of of environmental and social justice that he saw Gerard Manley Hopkins as articulating and as expressing in the most extraordinary poetry, some of the most extraordinary poetry in the English language. So I'll just read this one. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. As tumbled over rim in roundy wells, stones ring. Like each tucked string tells, each hung bell's bow, swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being indoors each one dwells, selves, goes itself. Myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. I say more. The just man justices, keeps grace. That keeps all his goings graces. Acts in God's eye what in God's eye he is, Christ. For Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs, and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. If you knew John, I would encourage you to email me, greg.garrod@ubc.ca, and I can provide you with a link to a celebration of life that's taking place in the UK on Friday. I think it's really appropriate to, those of us who knew him mourn his loss, but I just think it's appropriate to end with that poem of celebration from Gerard Manley Hopkins, because I think that's what John was all about. Thanks.